Welcome to The Just Life. I'm Benjamin Watson, and I'm joined today by Ruth Malhotra. She sits at the intersection of faith, justice, and public engagement. She actually works right now for Blue Trust as manager of strategic relationships and partnerships there. But I'm going to begin with the fact that she actually went to Georgia Tech. And as you know, I am a Georgia Bulldog. And so let's go ahead and get that out of the way, Ruth. You are a Georgia Tech Yellow Jacket. I love the fact that you're in public policy. I love the fact that you stand for what's right. But how did that happen, Georgia Tech?
Well, I grew up in Atlanta, loving the Yellow Jackets, and my dad has been a professor there. He was a professor there for over 45 years. It was his first and only job. Started in 1979 and worked there until God took him to heaven earlier this year. So Georgia Tech has been a big part of our family. We love the community, the academic rigor and excellence that they model. And it really is amazing to see people from really a cross section of the world converging on campus at Georgia Tech. I love it so much that I even have my run-ins on campus with the administration to try to preserve, the integrity of the institution. So had a wild ride.
That sounds like a thread that we should probably pull. We're going to pull a lot of threads today. I have no problem with Georgia Tech. I was just messing with you. If one of my kids wants to go to Georgia Tech and they pay for it, then I'll be all for it because it's close to where we are. That would be great. But I love it. I first met you, I think, I don't even remember. It might have been in D.C., having something to do with policy and just being a voice in the culture for faith. And that's where you have spent most of your professional career. You've been in spaces where you've been in public policy, where you've been in culture, where you've had to stand up for things like religious liberty in the past. You've spoken out now a lot about women's rights and those sorts of things. When did you first get interested, or did you ever think that you were going to be somebody who had this type of a voice on so many different issues, professionally and personally?
Yeah, I would say my advocacy journey has been very unexpected. And in some ways, I didn't expect to be sort of in these controversial settings, speaking out about difficult topics. But as I look back, I do see that even from a young age, I think I did have a keen sense of right and wrong. And I think my parents really taught me to see those on the margins. My family's originally from India. And so I've been to India 32 times. I love it so much. I have.
And so your families, you have extended family.
We have lots of extended family there. My parents were both born and raised there, came to the U.S. in the late 70s and 1980. But growing up in India, you see such a cross section of humanity. You see some of the wealthiest, people and most expensive real estate in places like Mumbai. And you also see the slum capitals of the world and some of the largest red light districts. And I think growing up, especially my mom taught me to see reality. And, even though we were often with, people who were well established and kind of more elite society, she made sure she took us to the slums and, to walk the dusty streets of the impoverished areas. And I think looking back, that made an indelible impression on me and did give me a passion to speak up, for those whose voices are not being heard.
So it kind of started from your parents or from your upbringing. I feel similarly for me, growing up in Virginia, my father was really into Civil War history and just history in general. But I always had this understanding of what injustice looked like in this country. But it's always great to hear from somebody who has more of a global perspective. Issues of injustice aren't just here in the United States. They're abroad. And many times, sometimes they're worse abroad and sometimes they're worse here. But the fact that you had that, that experience, I think, so there wasn't one like cataclysmic moment for you where you were like, okay, I'm going to devote my life in public policy and those sorts of things. Was it kind of a gradual thing?
I think it was gradual, but I think there were probably three defining experiences that I had that shaped my perspective on truth and justice and shining light. I think the first was, understanding our family story and realizing that God had called us out of, a pagan and polytheistic society in India and called us to, into a relationship with himself. And it really, my parents' journey and our family's journey was one of darkness to light. And so from a very young age, I think I, started to grasp that and realizing that light always brings clarity and healing. It certainly did in our, faith journey. So I think that was probably one thing that shaped kind of my general perspective and still does, just a desire to bring light and to live in the light. And then secondly, I think it was, at Georgia Tech. In a nutshell, I have been raised in a Christian home, gone to a Christian school, and I expected that Georgia Tech would be different. I knew it was a public secular campus with many different worldviews. But what I didn't expect is that people in authority would misuse their power and selectively enforce certain policies to censor voices they didn't like. And so all of a sudden I realized, man, this is not a level playing field. I expected a level playing field where everyone could express themselves freely without fear of reprisal. And when I saw people in authority actually stifling that rather than encouraging that, I think that was a big moment for me, realizing that everyone needs accountability and we all, need to steward our voices that God has given us and even that the laws of this land afford us. So that was, I think, a big moment for me when I was, kind of late teens, early 20s. And then I think the third thing, which we'll probably get into, was just, seeing the hypocrisy in Christendom and finding myself in the middle of, one of the biggest abuse crises, I think, of recent times in Christendom, and realizing like I have an obligation to speak up and to fight for what's right. So those are probably three experiences that lead me to where I am today.
I would imagine that there was quite a bit of disappointment in both of those scenarios. So on the one hand, you go to college and we have this idea that college is a place where ideas are transferred, where you come into a classroom, people from different backgrounds, but there's not an overarching narrative of what you should and shouldn't believe. The idea is to kind of come together like they did in Athens, and Paul goes to Athens, and you exchange ideas there. But that didn't happen for you. That had to be disappointing. And then there had to be some disappointment when you come into the church where there should be a higher calling of integrity, a higher calling to leadership and care for people. And it doesn't happen there. Let's start with the first one with the legal side of it. Sure. What should be the role of politics? You spend a lot of time in public policy. What should be the role in politics and policy when it comes to protecting religious freedom, even at a college campus?
Sure. I mean, I think university campuses are intended to be a marketplace of ideas, right? And it becomes a problem when there's only like one idea on the shelf that's being presented by those in authority. And so really, I think protecting free speech and free expression is paramount. I think, let every idea compete and may the best ideas win. That's what education is supposed to be about. I remember when I was just a sophomore in college at Georgia Tech, it was, I think, just my third semester there. And the dean of the liberal arts college called me into his office. And I had been taking a public policy class and sort of raising issues with some of the assertions that the professor was making. And the dean told me, he said, Ruth, you're asking too many questions in your class.
You're asking too many questions.
He says, you're here in college to listen and to learn. And I said, sir, isn't asking questions like big part of the learning process, like wrestling with these ideas? I said, it seems like what you're advocating for is indoctrination rather than education. You're telling students what to think, not teaching them how to think critically about these matters where there's multiple different perspectives. And he looked me in the eye and he said, Ruth, students have been indoctrinated for the first 18 years of their lives by their parents and by their churches. And we only have 4 years to undo the damage.
Are you kidding me?
I'm serious.
A professor told you that.
The dean of the entire liberal arts college who oversaw all the professors. And to me, that was, I was like 19 years old. Yeah. And it was such a eye-opening moment for me to realize, like, they're not even trying to hide the fact that this is their agenda. Like, they're so brazen about, we want to undo everything you've been taught your first 18 years. and we're going to pull out all the stops to do it because we only have 4 years.
Wow.
And so I think that really helped me understand like the need for us to leverage our constitutional rights. Georgia Tech is a public university campus. At the time, over 70% of college campuses had what are called speech codes, which prohibited, certain types of speech. At Georgia Tech, it was a tolerance policy that said you're not allowed to say anything intolerant or offensive.
Okay.
Well, how do you define that?
Yeah.
It was very selectively defined. They said we won't fund religious and political activities, only social and cultural activities. Well, how do you define that? It was, again, very arbitrary, lots of double standards. And so I think the role of government and public policy is really to clear the barriers for free expression. I mean, I know you're a student of the civil rights movement, as I'm trying to become. And one of the leaders, I believe, of the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Reverend Walter Fauntroy, he said, he was asked in an interview once, why was the civil rights movement so successful? There were so many things. They didn't have financial resources. They didn't have status. Their rights were being infringed on. Like, there were so many things against them. Like, how were they able to succeed? And he answered, he said 2 reasons: God Almighty and the First Amendment.
Wow. Yeah.
He said, we believe this was a calling from God, and we leveraged our rights to free speech and assembly, to advance a just cause. And so I think about that often. And I think public policy needs to certainly uphold the rights of everyone to speak freely and express themselves.
Yeah. So, I was in college probably way before you, right? You're 29.
I wish.
Are these things still happening? Because, when we were in college, it was happening. And now I think that sometimes people blow it out of proportion. I think it can be rhetoric now. I think especially in our political climate, people are sounding off alarms all the time when it's not necessarily something that's really happening. But do you think that thread is still prevalent in public education today at the college level?
That's a great question. So we have actually seen huge strides in terms of protecting speech and expression. We've seen at the public university level, and actually a lot of the ripple effects have affected private colleges as well. And so students today have greater rights to free speech than any other time in history. I mentioned that there were 70%, of the campuses had speech codes. Back in the day when I actually filed a civil rights lawsuit against Georgia Tech.
Wow.
Under the First Amendment. That was in 2006. It took 3 years in federal court. We did win our case every step of the way. And we not only got the policies repealed and changed for Georgia Tech, but it set precedent for other schools across the country. And there were many more cases like mine that set similar precedent. And so a much smaller percentage today of campuses have these speech codes or restrictions. And I think when you look at the college, when you look at the climate, like I said, students have greater rights than ever before. However, culture has shifted so much.
Yeah.
And, mainstream culture is so much more at odds with our values for those of us who, profess the Christian faith and seek to live according to, those theological principles. I mean, there's so many more challenges in that regard. When it comes to even things like human dignity, the right to life, you look at sexuality and things like that. And so I think there's an even greater need for students to know not just that they have those rights, but how to exercise them effectively.
Yeah, it's one thing to know you have them. I think a lot of students feel silenced in the classroom. So many times you read or you hear about students who, the professor is saying one thing, the climate on campus is a certain way, and many times believers they feel like they can't speak out, or they shouldn't speak out without having some sort of reprimand. So I applaud you for that. It's interesting how God takes people, how He prepares you for stuff that you didn't even know that was coming down the pipe for you in the future, and He takes you from experiencing things in India to Georgia Tech, experiencing that sort of injustice. And the Just Life is about this podcast is about justice. Justice is in everyday life, treating people with equality and equity and fairness and generosity, but it's also punishing those who deserve punishment and protecting those who deserve protection. That's what we see in Scripture. So fast forward into kind of the church.
Sure.
You mentioned being in the church, the disappointment that you've had, how you've seen power be abused. I want to talk a little bit about power dynamics. We've seen the power dynamics throughout your life. You've seen it. You saw it in India in the caste system. You saw it in the slums. You saw that. You experienced it when you went to Georgia Tech, and you saw it in the classroom with your professor. In the church, you worked for several years for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, huge organization, did a lot of good. I read many of Ravi's books. Many people read these books. Something happened a few years ago, and you were a part of that. Can you share your experience?
Sure. So, I went to Georgia Tech, studied public policy. I spent the first about 7 years of my career in that government space, campaigns and different, political efforts. And I got to see a cross section of America in that, kind of the richest of the rich in places like Boca Raton, Florida, wealthy retirees that had multiple cars in their drive. And they would tell us, our biggest problem is we have so much money, we don't know what to do with it.
Wow.
And from there, we go to places like Akron, Ohio, where I'd meet single moms working 3 jobs during the recession, trying to keep the heat on in their homes for their kids. And I realized that, what we need this is a spiritual problem. Like, I just want to tell them about Jesus and that, there's a hope and a purpose. And we're not going to solve like a spiritual problem with a political solution. And that was one thing that God taught me during that time. Another thing was that I saw a lot of hypocrisy, corruption, double standards, immorality. I was part of the so-called conservative movement. And I realized, I'd see people go up on stage and give a speech about family values and then turn around and, do things that were completely contrary to what they had just said. And so I grew, again, I was in my kind of mid-20s at this point, and I grew pretty disillusioned with all of that. And I said, for my next phase of my career, I just want to do something gospel-centric, like focused on sharing the hope of the gospel with a cross-section of society. And I said, I'm so kind of fed up with the corruption and immorality. I'm going to go into ministry, and the only person I want to work for is Ravi Zacharias.
There you go. which was not, it's not a bad thing.
Sure. I had actually known Ravi since I was about 4 years old. I went to preschool with his kids growing up, a little Christian school in Atlanta, and, continued elementary and high school. And kind of we were Indian Christian families in the same, greater Atlanta community. And so I had grown to admire his ministry in the field of apologetics, helping people defend the Christian worldview, and the different arenas that they were in, college campuses and CEO forums and the arts and education, entertainment, all these different places. And so in 2013, I, just approached the ministry and said, hey, I think God's calling me out of politics. I'd love to, if there's ever a role here, would love to be considered.
You just like,
I knew some of the family members and leadership there. And so I just kind of reached out to them. We had stayed in touch over the years. In fact, I had hosted the ministry when I was a student at Georgia Tech. I had hosted some of the team to come speak, and we had actually filmed some of our, in those days, it was video series and DVD series. We filmed those on campus. So I just said, I love the ministry and the areas of focus. Is there a place for me here now or in the future? And they invited me to come on board and lead public relations. At the time, I think we had a team of close to 300 people in 16 different countries. And my background was PR, communications, some of that policy too. And so that's what I did. And then shortly after that, Ravi Zacharias himself said, I'd love for you to travel with me on some of my more significant trips and events. I'd love for you to run the open forums that I do on college campuses.
So at that point, when that happened, how did you feel? Being, I guess that's a promotion, right? You're being elevated. How did you feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, I would tell people would say, is this your dream job at RZIM? And I would say, no, it's better than a dream job. I couldn't dream something like this up. I had spent much of my 20s like traveling the country with presidential candidates, and I thought that was cool. And here I am. Cool. It was pretty cool. Saw a lot, learned a lot, met some amazing people. But now I'm like traveling the world with this, renowned apologist, author, speaker. We're literally going all over the world, meeting people in these different spaces. And I thought nothing can top this. Yeah. But I mean, that was kind of my initial thought. I will say really from my first trip, my first international trip with Ravi a few months into working there, I realized a lot of the optics didn't seem right. I thought it was just optics. Yeah. In politics, you're kind of trained to see like how things appear and to avoid the appearance of impropriety. And so I saw things, but I just kind of questioned myself, or I would say like almost chastise myself for even having those questions or thoughts. And when I tried to raise concerns again, with some of the other staff, like, hey, are we concerned about how this looks, like Ravi going out with a young woman for the afternoon in a foreign country, on his own, things like that. I'm like, should we be, just take more, just be more wise in how this might appear. And I was very quickly chastised and I'm told to stay in my lane.
And why do you think that was? Was it because of your job title, your position, or was it something more than that? Was it money? Like, why would they tell you this is a ministry? And the reason why I think this hit a lot of people, it hit me because we have a certain idea or expectation of people in ministry. Now, at the same time, we understand that all have sinned, and we understand that we are all fallen, right? Sure. And so I think we mess up tremendously when we put leaders in a category of infallibility. But that being said, there is a certain expectation that people around leaders should hold them accountable. That's what we see in Scripture. We see the counsel of the wise. We see, iron sharpening iron. We see all those sorts of things. Why do you think they told you to basically be quiet?
Well, I think it's probably a number of factors, but there was a saying at RZIM amongst the staff that at RZIM, you're allowed to question Jesus, but you're not allowed to question Ravi.
Stop it. Come on, dog. That was not, you said that was on the wall?
It was not on the wall, but it was said in conversation. I mean,
that's
really,
how people really
my
felt.
first week in orientation as a new staff member, I remember my manager sitting me down and saying, whatever you do, if you want to succeed here, do not question Ravi and do not cross the Zacharias family. He said everything else is pretty much
game.
Fair game, but don't do those two things. And I remember thinking, oh, okay. I mean, of course, like I was raised to respect, authority. And I, especially in the Indian culture, it's a very honor shame culture. And you're raised to really honor those, who are elder, those who are in positions of especially spiritual, authority or influence. And so I was like, of course I'm here to honor and serve. And, of course the honoring his family is part of that, but it really had a chilling effect on the staff. And, I think there was such a atmosphere of, just that it was not safe to ask questions or raise concerns when it came to, Ravi or those in authority. Yeah. It's like everything sort of revolved around him. I mean, we were often told, including by his wife who worked there, she would say, this is Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Yeah. It's not insert some other name, International Ministries, And so I think as much as they, on one hand, would talk about building a team and wanting to expand, the reach and build up other voices, it really was largely revolving around him and sort of this celebrity culture that came with him.
Did finances play a part in that whole thing as well?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a lot of money tied up in this. We were, I believe, at one point around a $40 million a year organization. This is all, private donations. Yep. By, we had something called a founders circle, which several hundred people were part of who, contributed significantly. We had a board of directors and advisors who were largely Ravi's family and friends. I would say pretty much exclusively those in his inner circle. And most of them were also big donors. And so you had to keep them happy.
Yeah.
And it all kind of, it was very lavish in terms of the lifestyle and the, it was very opulent the way we kind of operated as a ministry, fancy hotels and resorts and, very kind of elaborate meals and trips. And, there's part of you that early on is like, man, this is a good deal. We get to share the gospel around the world.
For the president, right?
It is. When I worked on campaigns, I mean, we were staying at
well, part of it is I think not only the scrutiny, but the accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, unfortunately, when it comes to public service or the presidential campaigns, sure, they can hide money here and there, but there is a public scrutiny where they need to be above reproach.
Absolutely.
And too often we see in the faith sector, sometimes there's not that same accountability. You mentioned family members being around him. And this isn't just to bash Ravi and RZIM, because this happens in a lot of instances where there's family members, where people can't hold people accountable. They can't say anything. And then people like you who notice certain things feel silenced. How and when did you start to find your voice? Was it after the public knew what happened, or were there times before that where you started to feel like, I need to say something and tell somebody about what's happening?
Yeah, I would say it was really in 2017 when a woman came forward, actually someone who had been at one of our donor events in Canada. Her name is Lori-Ann Thompson. And, she was alleging grooming and sexual abuse by Ravi, very serious allegations. And initially, again, I'm Ravi's spokesperson at this point, and charged with sort of all the messaging for the global ministry. And when, Lori-Ann Thompson came forward with these allegations, Ravi initially denied everything. He was like, I don't even know her. I meet a lot of people. I don't know what she's talking about. I may have met her, but, and within the course of a few months, he changed his story 8 times. It went from, I don't know her. Oh, I met her, but I met her and her husband, but we didn't really correspond after that. Oh, we did correspond, but only by email, and her husband was copied in on it. Well, then phone records leak. Well, oh yeah. Well, she tried to call me, but I didn't answer. Oh, well, I did answer, but I never talked for a long time. And then we'd see there'd be sometimes hours long phone calls.
Yeah.
He'd say, oh, well, I counseled her, but she had long prayer requests. And I mean, it literally to the point where it came out that they were in a 2.5-year relationship that his wife did not know about. They were gifts exchanged, all sorts of inappropriate, sexually charged communication. And Ravi was still trying to deny. There's a saying that people only admit to what they think you already know.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's what I observed. And so I was asking a lot of questions. I felt like, as a matter of integrity, I'm not going to make a statement on his behalf that I know to be untrue or that I can't defend myself. But it was, during that time, he mistakenly copied me on an email with his personal attorney where they were talking about what had happened and that they had to pay her off to be silent because no one else could know.
And up to that point, did you know who this woman was? You knew who she was?
I mean, I only knew of her. I knew of her name.
Yeah.
I had not had any communication with her, or I didn't know much about her. I just know there's a woman in Canada by the name of Lori-Ann Thompson who was saying these things.
Were you thinking there's no way, or were you thinking probably?
Initially, I wanted to believe like this can't be true. Initially when I heard it, it sounded so extreme, what she was alleging. And I thought, well, I started to think back to, okay, I've seen Ravi, interact with women in ways that made me feel slightly uncomfortable, but I didn't think anything was actually happening. And then I'm reading what she's alleging and I'm thinking, my initial response was I wanted to believe Ravi. I mean, this is someone I wanted to respect and be loyal to. And he said, oh, she's just an extortionist. And that narrative very early on sounded like maybe it could fit, but it soon started to unravel. And with every piece of information that came out, her story added up and his didn't. His was falling apart. And he was a smart guy. I mean, he could, remember lots of facts and figures, and, he could articulate these messages. And I'm thinking, for him to change his story 8 times within the course of a few months, there's something wrong here. It's like, where there's smoke, there's usually fire.
Yeah.
And so that was really hard, because at every point it felt like my trust in him and the leadership around him was eroding. And the posture of others in leadership was not, let's get to the bottom of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
It was, let's sort of smooth things over and continue with business as usual. Like, whatever we need to do to keep the ministry going, whatever we need to say, that's what we're going to prioritize. Yeah. And I had thought back to my political days and my PR days. There's something called the Bill Clinton strategy, which is, if you remember the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. Yeah. And it's this, the Clinton strategy is to delay, deny, defy, and defame. It's like, first you delay the news from even getting out. Delay, deny, defy, defame. Yeah. So first, delay it from ever getting out. And that's what we tried to do. Let's just keep this under the radar. No one needs to know. We'll figure it out internally. The second is to deny when it does come out, to say, this didn't happen. I didn't do this. I don't know what they're talking about. This is just an attack. Mm-hmm. The third is to defy, take a defiant posture. When it becomes clear that, okay, something has happened here. Yeah. Well, you're just defiant. Like, it's none of your business. Who are you? This is between me and my family and my God. Y'all get out of the way. And the final stage is to defame those who are coming forward, to discredit. And that's exactly what happened. And it wasn't just, let's defame the survivors who are coming forward. It was, let's defame and discredit those internally, like myself, who are trying to shine light and get to the bottom of the truth.
Did you ever feel like you were in any physical danger or harm? Were there any threats? Many times when something like this happens on this scale, people look to eliminate, in some respect, or at least silence people who know the truth and are willing and have a loyalty to the truth over people. Mm-hmm. Did you ever feel like, your career would be threatened, or your livelihood, your well-being would be threatened if you spoke out?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I mean, in terms of physical danger, I did receive some threatening emails and letters, and, turn those over to law enforcement, and they were trying to get to the bottom of who sent them. And, they had some ideas of where they came from, but it wasn't conclusive. And so there was actually a period of time where I went out of state and stayed, with some family friends in a different state under the radar. Only my parents and about 4 or 5 people knew where I was. So that was difficult. But then certainly when it came to my career prospects and my relationships, I thought, if I go public about what I've seen, who's going to want to hire me? Like, no one wants to hire a whistleblower. There's too much controversy attached. I was disbelieved for so long. So I had been speaking up internally from 2017 to 2020. Amongst the leadership, 4 years. It was, about 3.5 years. And this was the senior leadership team. There was a task force that I was part of, again, with our CEO and others. And our CEO was his daughter, so that didn't help. Ravi's daughter. Yep. Again, lots of family and different connections involved. But it was so disheartening, demoralizing, really devastating to be disbelieved, or to be, at one point they said, Ruth, our president said, Ruth, you're tired and emotional, and you're just not seeing things clearly. They brought in another. It's your fault. Exactly. Yeah. They brought in a consultant who said, you're one step away from complete and total insanity.
Are you serious?
Yes. They actually suspended me for 3 months.
But this goes into the not the denial, the defame. This is kind of the discredit.
The discrediting, the gaslighting. I didn't even know the term gaslighting at the time, but they were like, Ruth, you need to take time away, and we want to care for you because clearly you're overwhelmed. And so they dismissed me temporarily. They actually confiscated my phone and computer, my work devices. They said, we think you're building a dossier to bring down Ravi. They told the team that Ruth is mentally unstable, and it's the type of insanity that it's one of the president told one of the groups, it's the type of insanity that it's impossible to recover from. And so they actually sent me to, they were trying to send me to a counselor to set me straight. And that person referred me to someone else who's actually right down the street from here in Peachtree City, Georgia, Dr. Tim Lane. And my first session with Dr. Lane, I didn't know who he was. I thought, man, this is not going to be good. He's going to be an extension, of RZIM and the leadership. Yeah. This was in 2019. And my first session with him, he said, Ruth, you are not the crazy one. I think you're the only one seeing things clearly. He said, I think RZIM is engaged in a cover up. I think Ravi is culpable and they're trying to make you the scapegoat. It's not a safe place for you. And he said, I'm here to help you and to advocate for you. And we're going to figure this out. And so that was one of the turning points, in my journey. And that really, he actually urged me not to go back when my forced sabbatical or suspension was up. I didn't listen. I was very loyal. And I said, no, Ravi's going to repent. I'm going to be part of this process. Ravi's going to have a Psalm 51 moment, this mea culpa, I have sinned. We're going to go through this collective sackcloth and ashes, season as a ministry. God's going to use it. I had this vision for how this thing could play out, and I wanted to be part of it. So I did go back a few months later, and, things unraveled after that. We kind of had a few months of flying high, but then COVID hit, Ravi got cancer. He passes away. All these women come forward alleging sexual abuse. It turns out he owned 2 massage parlors, here in the area in Atlanta. He owned 2 condos in Bangkok, Thailand, where he would take sex tourism trips. I mean, it was awful. So there was, an investigation. I became one of the key witnesses in the investigation while I was still spokesperson for RCIM.
Awkward.
It's like walking a tightrope.
You walking into work, people looking at you like, oh, what?
I know. And I would ask God, I wanted to resign so many times during that. Yeah. But I really felt a conviction from the Lord, like, this is not the time. I have not released you yet. And the investigators, I was helping them in different ways. And so God just told me, tell the truth at all times and I'll protect you. You cannot go wrong telling the truth. So whether I was talking to media on behalf of RZIM, of course I was measured and wise, but, I'd always tell the truth, would never make a statement that I believed to be untrue. And of course, with the investigation, I was turning over, I had 7 years of correspondence and calendars from all my travels with Ravi and things like that. And so that was a very hard season, but I remember, and in the course of that, had sort of been given like anonymity in the investigation. I didn't have to attach my name to things publicly, but I really believed in order to bring accountability and shine light on the systemic nature of the injustice. It wasn't just Ravi was a bad apple who fooled all of us. What he did could not have happened in a vacuum. And I came to understand, like, it takes a system to conceal and enable this abuse. And that's what's been happening for years. Yeah. And I realized I have to go public about my own experience and what I've personally witnessed, in this system, if there's going to be wider scale accountability. And so I had mentors and advisors who were urging me to do that and showing me how. I had, one of my mentors said, Ruth, you need to turn the lights on. She's like, you're the only one who can really do it, given the vantage point that you have. But it was hard. Another mentor, David French, you might know, he was kind of walking me through, here's the most effective way to do it. Here's the legal things to consider. He was actually my attorney at Georgia Tech. So how's that for a full circle moment? Wow. David defended me in my case. I was the plaintiff in the Georgia Tech case many years ago in 2006. And here he and his wife, Nancy, were walking me through this whistleblower journey. And at one point I said, David, who's going to want to hire a whistleblower? Like, isn't this career suicide? And he said, Ruth, your job is to be obedient to the Lord, and you have to trust that the right doors will open and the wrong ones will close. He said, people who admire your courage and integrity will want you on their team. And those who don't want the scrutiny. Like those aren't the type of people you want to work for anyway, if people have a problem with what you did. And so that was clarifying for me. I had a coach who I was working with, TJ Wallace. And I remember him telling me at one point, everyone was saying, Ruth, this is so hard. We're so sorry. I know going public is going to be hard, but it's something you need to do. And at one point I got really fed up and I said, can't we make it easier? Yeah. Like, why is it so hard? And why does it come down to me? There's this massive institution, hundreds of people, tens of millions of dollars.
Well, I think if you look at your life, you've been uniquely prepared for this moment. And it's difficult. It's hard. It's hard to say. We were talking about in Matthew chapter 1, there's genealogy and there's 5 women that are named in Jesus's genealogy. Bathsheba, Rahab, Ruth,
sure.
And you think about what those women, they didn't know the outcome of their line, their genealogy when they were alive. They faced the injustice, but they didn't know how God was going to redeem it. And one of the most difficult things, I think, especially in the power dynamics, is specifically when it comes to men and how men abuse women in different ways. You mentioned it being a system, and that's true. There's a system. There's a bunch of people that are around that are allowing someone to act with impropriety, and they're supporting it.
Sure.
We face these systems all the time. But within that, and as you see in Matthew 1, there's this court of redemption that doesn't make it okay what happened to Bathsheba. But you see how on the end of it, we see looking back, she didn't know. You see how God brought life through that. And in many ways, you are bringing life to people, to women. You're challenging systems. You're preventing these things from happening again. And so I applaud you for that. There's 2 words that you mentioned to me: exposed and invisible. Exposed and invisible. Who told you those words, and what do they mean to you right now?
Yeah, it has been a hard journey, and I appreciate you reminding me of the sort of biblical paradigm that we have to look back at and cling to. And one of my coach, who I mentioned earlier, TJ Wallace, he told me in the course of that, he said, Ruth, we can't make this easy, but we can make it worth it. And if we do this the right way, it will be worth it. And God will, meet you in this, and it'll be rewarding. And it wasn't until later in the season I'm living in now that I've started to have some of those rewarding interactions and encounters, and to see how it has been worth it. And I would say that unequivocally. It's been a difficult journey, but telling the truth is always worth it. Obedience is always worth it. One of the most impactful encounters that I had was, in the course of the investigation, there were, as I mentioned, so many women coming forward from different seasons of Ravi's life who were alleging abuse in horrific ways. Many of them were massage therapists or, in related fields, and he took advantage of them. It's truly devastating. And I got to know several of them in the investigation and in the months that followed. One woman in particular, she goes by Mary. That's not her real name, but we'll call her Mary. And she lives in another part of the country. And so I was corresponding with her and, lots of phone calls with her. I finally got to go down to visit her a few years ago. And she lived in very difficult conditions. It was one of the hardest environments I've seen here in the U.S. She was living in an abandoned trailer park and had a very difficult life. And many of these women had. And that's the thing, is predators prey on vulnerable people. We can't use their checkered pasts to discredit their testimony. It actually bolsters their testimony, because we know that that's who predators go after. So this is one of the women who'd been preyed upon. And as I'm talking to her and, spent about 3 days with her down there, and Mary is sharing different parts of her story piece by piece. And at one point, she looks at me and she says, Ruth, abuse victims in the church often feel both exposed and invisible at the same time. She said, we feel exposed because we're vulnerable, we're targeted, we're taken advantage of. People are kind of out there to, use us. But we also feel invisible because, we're marginalized, and when we try to speak up, we're not seen or heard or believed. And that broke my heart. I mean, it was so gripping to hear that, and really devastating to hear that. And all I could tell her through tears was, Mary, the God I know is a God who sees and a God who protects. And I'm so sorry for the times that the church has not reflected that to you.
Wow.
And so that was a pivotal conversation for me. And Mary was so generous with her time and her insights and sharing from her experiences. And we remain friends today. I just heard from her a few days ago. And, she's in a much better situation now, and God is restoring her life. She recently turned 50, actually. And she said, Ruth, this is my year of Jubilee. And God is restoring so much of what was lost. And so it's a beautiful friendship. And I have many other friendships with survivors who I've sought to learn from. But when I started to think about this exposed and invisible kind of motif, I thought, man, how many people in our circles would say we feel exposed and invisible? I think there's so many applications to that. Yeah. When you think about racial injustice, as I know, you're a champion of justice and reconciliation. And, I think so many Black Americans would say we feel exposed and invisible. We feel exposed. We're targeted. The rules of the road are different for us. But we're often not believed when we try to share our experiences, right? Or I think about disability, and especially those living, who are differently abled in our churches and communities. I think many of them would say that those who have special needs children, I mean, so many women in the workplace, even in corporate America. I work in the financial services space now, and I get to work for a wonderful Christian firm where we're, trying to be countercultural and are in many ways. But when I talk to people in the wider sphere who are working, whether they're working on Wall Street or working in tech, many of them will say we feel exposed and invisible. We're targeted, but yet we're not seen. We're not, adequately promoted or championed or even heard when we try to speak in the boardroom. And so I think there's a lot of applications for that. And I think for us as followers of Jesus, I mean, he's the ultimate example of someone who saw those on the margins, right? Yeah. I think it's helped me see Jesus in a whole new light, because when you look at his earthly ministry, I mean, he really reserved his harshest critique and disdain for the religious elite who were taking advantage of others, right? Yeah. And he showed his deepest compassion and inclusion to those on the margins, to those who had been discounted or discarded by society. Yeah. And I think often in Christendom, we do the opposite. And so that's convicting for me. God continues to show me ways that sometimes, even inadvertently, we prop up people in power and ignore those whose voices are not being heard. And so I think that's a challenge for all of us.
Part of justice is people are due justice, whether you agree with their situation or not, whether you experience the same injustice. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to issues of abuse, you will see people who have been abused. They'll be at the forefront of those fights for justice. You see people who have experienced racial injustice, like they'll be the ones at the forefront. You'll see people who have been wrongly convicted or something. They'll be at the ones standing at the forefront of that fight. But justice spans over all those sorts of things. What would you say to people who say, I don't know anybody who has experienced this in the church or experienced this type of abuse? Should they be involved in this issue?
Absolutely. I think the fight for justice, and specifically advocacy for those who've been victims of abuse of power, is something that all of us need to be engaged in. I think it's something that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
How so?
I think when you look at the systems that are created, when there's a lack of accountability, like no one wins in that. It may seem like, the person in power is getting to, operate without any interference and like the ministry is going on. And, I heard someone say recently that the most efficient form of government is a dictatorship.
Yeah.
And you could say that for a church or ministry too. Like the most efficient form is when the guy at the top calls all the shots with no interference or accountability. But is that the most God honoring form? I mean, you end up with systems in the name of God that actually look nothing like him. Dr. Diane Langberg talks about this a lot. She says, anything done in his name that doesn't look like him is not of him. And she says, when a body stops following the head, it's a sick body. And that's what we have with the church now. We have a church who is not following the head, who's Jesus Christ. And we have a sick church. We have a community of, Christendom that's in trouble. And so whether you're directly a victim of, abuse or not, if you're part of this, wider community that claims the name of Christ, or if you want to be someone who operates, with justice and compassion wherever God has placed you, this is something that you need to be aware of and engaged in. Don't wait for something to happen to you or your daughter or your friend for you to care. I think part of being a Jesus follower is saying, who has God placed in my path? Whose voice is not being heard, who is not sitting at the table. I think about that a lot. I'm in a lot of meetings, as you are, with people of influence and authority. And I'm often wondering, okay, who's not at the table who should be? And can I use my seat, my space to advocate for them and what's important to them?
So Ruth, oftentimes in this context, the idea of consent comes up. And outside of what scripture says about these types of relationships, just setting that to the side for a minute. A lot of times you will hear, leaders, pastors, especially in this, Christian context, they will talk about consent. What were these actions consensual between adults? But I think that we miss the mark on that in a lot of different ways, especially as men. Mm-hmm. In your experience and what you've gone through, what you've seen, hearing from these women, like what do men need to know, but what does the culture need to know about consent and power in this type of context?
Sure, absolutely. I think there's a real need for us to understand power dynamics. If you are a man in any type of authority, be it a pastor, a leader, a CEO, a teacher, a professor, by virtue of the authority and position that you hold, you cannot have a consensual relationship or interaction with someone below you, with a student, with a congregant, with someone you're counseling.
Even if you're of age. Because everybody will say, like, you're of age, you're over 18, these are two consenting. You hear it all the time. These are two consenting adults, and it's a boss and it's somebody that works for him. And they say it's two
you do,
adults.
But usually you hear that from the person in power or the institution in power. You very rarely hear that from the victim or, the in this case, like the woman in the relationship. I mean, and again, yes, it can go both ways, but more often than not, we have men who are in positions of power. And I think, there's a whole category called adult clergy sexual abuse, which everyone needs to familiarize themselves with. There are so many misconceptions and misunderstandings around this. And there are some wonderful experts like Dr. David Pooler out of Baylor University, or Dr. Diane Langberg, who's been a leader in this field for decades. Dr. Jennifer Fried, who has a whole, body of work around institutional courage and around DARVO. We hear the term DARVO, DARVO, which stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So you often see, again, men in power, just to be candid, I said often, not always, but often you'll see men in power employ a DARVO tactic where, again, they deny, the allegation. It's like deny, delay, deny, defy, defame, very similar to the Bill Clinton strategy. They attack and then they reverse the victim and the offender. They're like, oh no, she seduced me. She was an extortionist. She was seductive. She did this. She did that. She tripped me up. And again, we see this throughout time, right? Yeah. Even going back to scriptural accounts. But I think it's so important to understand the power dynamics that are often in place, and to realize that if you are a person of power or authority. And first of all, you have to realize that, one of the most dangerous person is someone who wields a lot of power and doesn't realize it. I have a certain amount of power because of, my relationships and influence and accomplishments. You have a great deal of power because of the platform God has given you. Everyone watching this, I imagine, has some form of power that they've been given, and powerful people shouldn't feel guilty.
Yeah.
But they should feel responsible. If you have that authority over others, if you are, a teacher with students under you, like that's not a cause to feel guilty, but you need to be responsible in how you exercise that. And you have to realize that when you suggest something, when you make a comment, when you, even ask a question or criticize, or make assumptions, like you are exercising your power over that person. It's not as if it's two equals on the same playing field, engaging in interaction. It's actually a very significant differential. And that often leads to abusive behaviors. I mean, there's a real tendency to minimize when someone in power abuses someone else, especially when it comes to sexual abuse. There is such a tendency to minimize it. My former boss, Ravi, the way he said it, he said, I failed to exercise wise caution in my digital communications with this woman. Like that's all he ever admitted to in his lifetime. Other times they'll say, it was an affair, it was a consensual affair. It was an inappropriate relationship. It was an indiscretion, it gave the appearance of impropriety. I mean, there's all this language, much of which has been spun up by PR professionals over the years in crisis management situations to minimize what actually happened. And when you peel back the layers and when you start to look at the work of Dr. Pooler and Dr. Langberg and others, you'll realize, like, wow, this is not an inappropriate relationship. This is not a mere indiscretion. This is actually one person who systematically abused their position of power over someone else in order to get what they wanted. That has to stop, and that has to be understood for it to stop.
And it has to be understood by men.
Absolutely.
Because to be honest with you, men, well, I'm to be honest with you, but this, men are in a power position. They're in a control position. The legal system is set up to protect them in many ways. We see it not only in sexual abuse, we see it in a lot of other instances where men are protected and they have the ability to do that. That's why I never discredit when a woman comes out about something that happened and it's 5 years have passed, 10 years have passed, 20 years have passed. I don't look at her and say, well, or we shouldn't look at her and say, well, why didn't you say something then? Why'd you wait till now? Because the truth of the matter is the power dynamics silenced her at that point. And she had to make a decision many times, and you add into this where you see fit, many times she has to weigh on the scales of believability, loss of well-being, loss of her job, all those sorts of things. And it's not until 5-10 years later that she's even able to realize that what happened to her was not okay. And so then she comes out with it later. So that's another manifestation of the power that men have in the culture.
Absolutely. I think we really need more laws in place that, in so many states you have like the statute of limitations, whereby you cannot bring legal action after, a defined number of years. Yeah. I think that ends up really hurting, victims and those who've been taken advantage of. I think we need more laws around something like clergy sexual abuse. You already have laws in certain professions, like with counseling and, different therapy and treatment professions where it's like illegal for, a mental health professional to engage in a relationship with a client. And so I think a lot of those things need to be extended and need to be, across the board in every state. Right now, it's very state specific. And so there's so many factors that inhibit a woman from speaking up. Like why would a woman, when you start to understand the different dynamics that someone is up against and how difficult it is to speak up. And especially when you add a spiritual layer to it. I mean, it's bad enough when it's a man in power.
Mm.
When you add like someone with spiritual authority and influence, it becomes infinitely harder.
Mm.
And this is something that I have really had to learn. And it's been heartbreaking for me to hear this from the survivors I've gotten to know. But, early on, I mentioned that several of the women my former boss abused have become friends, and they've, asked if they could share their experiences with me. And I was so touched by that. But in one conversation in particular, I would often end a conversation like that saying, "Hey, can I pray for you before we end?" Like, that's just something I was raised to do. And, really believe in the power of prayer. And I realized this one woman will say, "No, I don't want you to pray for me while we're here, but I'm going to tell you my prayer request so you can pray later." And I was like, "Oh, okay, no problem. I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." And it was only several months into our relationship that she told me, she said, "Ravi would always pray before he raped me. He would make us pray together." And so prayer is triggering. When someone asks to pray with me, that's what it reminds me of. And I can't handle that. She said, "I love God. I believe in prayer, but I can't, have someone pray with me because of what your boss used to do to me after we prayed together." And I mean, to me, that is the ultimate example of someone taking God's name in vain.
Yeah.
We think taking God's name in vain is saying a cuss word here or there. And I don't advocate for that either. But to me, when I heard that, it was so profoundly devastating. And to realize like that is spiritual abuse at its worst. I mean, that's one of the worst examples that I've ever heard or encountered. And I mean, of course, there's many other ways that spiritual language can be misused. I know it was misused against me. I'm someone who loves the scripture. And I remember, passages like Matthew 18 about going to your brother directly.
Yeah.
That was used against me. They're like, "Well, have you sat down with Ravi and asked him all your questions?" I'm like, think about the power dynamic. This is someone who's, practically twice my age. And, he's the founder and president of the company. He's a globally renowned speaker and author. And like, I'm one of the lowest people on the org chart. I'm just a little PR person here. And you want me to sit down with him to confront him about allegations of sexual abuse? Like, I mean, you just think about how absurd that is, but that's often, what people are asked to do, be it in a church or ministry, nonprofit, other professional contexts. And so I think we have to be wise and understanding power dynamics, I think, is a crucial step in learning to advocate for justice in this space.
Yeah. Advocacy can look different for different people.
It can, absolutely.
Some people, it's okay if you're someone who leverages your relationships and you speak from the pulpit, so to speak. But there's also this interpersonal piece of it, of laying down your life, in essence, or opening your life to someone who is experiencing this sort of atrocity. Lastly, how are you doing with your restoration and healing? Because I know we talked and you're like, you have to go through a process of like healing and being restored and counseling. And like, you went through a lot, Ruth. Like nobody should go through that. Like nobody should be in a situation where they are working at any place in business, but definitely not in a church, not in a ministry. Nobody should go through a situation where the person that they are looking to basically feed them spiritually is prowling on others and taking advantage of other people. How has your road to recovery been? Like, what did that look like for you? Was it just solitude, or were there like some steps that you are going through and had to go through in order to deal with that?
Well, I would say it's ongoing, and this podcast is probably part of that journey. This is one of the first more public conversations I'm having about this. It's taken me several years to just feel the peace and confidence and even permission from the Lord to talk about this more publicly. I've done some smaller things here and there, but I think a lot of my healing has been first of all, I'm so grateful for the friends and family who stood beside me through all this roller coaster journey, and who were in my corner and are in my corner. I think it really has meant a lot not to be alone, because something like this feels very isolating, and loneliness, whether real or perceived, can creep in. And so having that strong base, and even though sometimes a small, close-knit circle of trusted friends and family to go to for support and guidance and counsel and prayer, has been invaluable. I would say, secondly, having help from the experts, professionals, people who, I have been in therapy for all of this time, several years now, and I still, that's still part of my weekly routine almost every week. And that's been a game changer too, I think, in helping me make sense of my story in the broader context, talking to experts and professionals who understand the dynamics from a psychological standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from, can zoom out in wider Christendom and say, here's how your story makes sense in this broader narrative of what's playing out in the church today, of what God is doing, of what God's called you to specifically. I think that's been very clarifying and healing. And I think lots of pondering and reflection. I'm really grateful that God opened up a door for me to work at a wonderful, Christian firm where I'm surrounded by people of integrity. And before I took the job, I told the CEO, sir, I just need a season to rest and heal, and think about the future. And he said, Ruth, why don't you come here to rest and heal with us? Yeah. And I think God provided that after a season of seeing the worst side of complicity and corruption, and people using their resources and their influence, for negative things. They're, misusing their power. I think I'm in a season where I'm getting to see some of the best side of people who are truly leveraging what they've been given, who understand they're stewards, that God owns it all. God's given it to them, and they're here to steward that for the good of others. So I think those things have been rewarding. And I'll just say healing it's a journey. I don't know that we'll ever fully arrive this side of heaven. I don't know that we're fully and finally healed. I think something like this changes you. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think it's actually healthy that I don't see things the same way as I used to. Sometimes people ask me, don't you wish sometimes you could just flip a switch and go back to how things were like 10 years ago? And I'm like, no, I don't want that. I think God has given me greater insight and, capacity to care for others. And so that's a gift for which I'm grateful, even though it was a painful process to get here.
Well, I'm grateful for you sharing your gift. I'm grateful for you speaking about it. I'm grateful for your courage. And people don't like, a lot of people don't know you, but you have a way of like lighting up a room. And it's not just because you take selfies and there's a flash on there, but Ruth always takes selfies whenever she's at. Like, you can document your life. When you saw Ruth, because she's going to send you some pictures of you and her. But that's the type of person that you are. And it's infectious. And for somebody to have gone through what you've gone through, and to still have that, it's not just a credit to you, it's a credit to the God you serve.
Absolutely.
So I thank you for, not just for joining me for the conversation, but I thank you for being a voice for the voices. I thank you for engaging with survivors. And I thank you for being willing to change and to pivot where God is pointing you, because he's taking you to different places at different times in your life for specific purposes and specific spheres. And now he is taking you on another journey that I know you were going to, walk through faithfully. So one last thing, if you could fill in this sentence, the just life means what? In your opinion, the just life means what?
In my opinion, the just life actually means three things. Am I allowed to say three?
You can get all the blanks you want.
I need three blanks.
Yeah, of course.
I think first of all, recognizing that God is our judge. And sometimes we're always accountable to an audience of one. There may be other people in the, around, but realizing that he himself is just in his very essence, and he's the one we exist to please. I think secondly, a just life is using power to serve and speak up for others. You mentioned the voiceless. I actually don't like that term voiceless, because unless you're unborn, and I know you advocate for the unborn, but unless you're unborn, everyone has a voice.
Yeah.
It's just that their voices aren't being heard. And so I prefer to think about it like that. Am I using my power to speak up for those whose voices are not being heard? Or am I using it to prop up my own interests and agenda? And then finally, I think the just life is telling the truth at all times and taking responsibility. I think if we just did those two things,
you'd be good.
Tell the truth and take responsibility. I'm sure you want your kids to do that.
Exactly.
You want people who work for you to do that. Like if every leader and really everyone in every institution would just commit to telling the truth and taking responsibility, we'd all be in much better shape.
Amen. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right.